Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to episode 25 of the Cloudcast. We're coming to you live from our massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. You know, back in February of this year, the last block of IP4 addresses were officially handed out, meaning that if you still have dust collecting on your IPv6 books that you bought years ago, it might be time to pull them off the shelf and start figuring out how all this stuff works. So the good news is today, if you aren't already an IPv6 guru, we have two of them on the show today. So we've got Shannon McFarland, Principal Engineer from Cisco. Shannon, how you doing?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
And we've got Dr. Chip Popoviciu, Founder and CEO of Nefo6. Chip, how are you today?
Doing great, Brian.
Good. I'm going to give a really quick backstory on you guys, and then I want you to introduce yourselves and tell me what you're working on. So, for all the listeners, I've known Chip and Shannon for over a decade and more than that. Chip and I worked together way back at Cisco in the TAC. We hired Chip out of. He had gotten his PhD, knew absolutely nothing about networking, but we figured at the time, if the guy's smart enough to get a PhD in physics, he's smart enough to figure out how to configure routers. So, Chip, I don't know if you remember back in those days when we did the interviews, but it was an interesting bringing you in, trying to explain everything to you. You were way smarter than we were in most areas.
Yes, it was. I still remember those days. It was a lot of fun. Those early days in Cisco and the teams and the interviewing process. It was a lot of excitement because the questions were always an interesting exercise in logic, not just the basic knowledge. And just to tie it all together, Brian, good opportunity for me to thank you for the mentoring early on. That was a great experience in learning networking.
You're very welcome. And right around 2000 or so, Shannon was working in technical marketing for Cisco. I was doing similar thing. And they took the two of us through a reorganization, and they said, you guys, Shannon was working on multicast and IPv6, two technologies that I think you were amongst a handful of people that understood it. And I was working on SIP, which was sort of the bastard child of voice protocols. And they said, you're now in the incubating technologies group. And I remember you and I sitting there going, incubating, huh? That's what we're going to do.
Yeah, I think we were both struggling to find something positive about that new organization title.
Exactly. So, it only took 10 years, and now SIP is sort of prevalent in voice over IP, and here we are talking about IPv6. So, guys, thanks for coming on the show. So, like I mentioned, Shannon and Chip are sort of two of the very leading people in the industry. Not just talking about IPv6, but you guys have helped people deploy some very, very large environments. So are we finally at a stage where we have to learn this stuff?
Go for it, Chip.
So Shannon and I indeed had an opportunity to work over the years on V6, even back when it was not the most popular thing, if you would. But indeed, to a great extent, this event of finally V4 address space being exhausted in the global pool, and shortly thereafter the address pool being exhausted in Asia Pacific really triggered a lot of interest. And what we are seeing here is not just this drive based on a fear about the impact that it will have on the growth of businesses and connectivity from a global perspective, but we are also seeing, very interestingly enough, we are seeing the market leaders that are taking a very proactive role in deploying V6 from a differentiating perspective. So yes, without a doubt, we are seeing a turn into the interest that the industry has on IPv6.
Yeah. So help me with so Chip, give people like a 2-minute background of what Nefo6 does, because you guys you were doing IPv6 stuff at Cisco up until maybe a year or so ago, but what are you doing at Nefo6 now? And more importantly, as you explain that, walk us through some of the process that you're helping people go through these transitions from 4 to 6, learning the technologies, dealing with the transitions, and kind of understanding why it's valuable to them.
Yes, so Nefo6 was started earlier this year in May, actually, and it's already was able to put together a very good team, very experienced team in terms of IPv6 expertise. We were able to put together a team that is pretty well known in the industry, We are offering IPv6 transition services, but at the same time, we are offering cloud transition services. And there is an important parallel between the two that we have observed based on the engagements that we had so far, starting with Mifos and even before. We strongly believe that there are two, actually three, but for the purpose of this conversation, two major inflection points happening in this industry at the same time. They are complex, they are interdependent, and they are touching everything in the IT environment. At the bottom layer, you have the transition to IPv6, which is all about scalability. And then on top, the transition to cloud and adoption of cloud, which we see it as being all about agility. And in terms of the services that Mifos 6 offers, we are helping our customers go from V4 to V6 through all the relevant stages. So we work with them on strategy definition, we work with them on assessment and planning, and then design and implementation. We do the same thing for cloud, and on the cloud side, we particularly focus on the orchestration story related to cloud. But the bottom line is that if there is a one takeaway from my message today, is that I think people need to start looking at V6 and cloud together. And when they define a strategy for one, they need to take into consideration the strategy for the other in order to avoid rework and in order to maximize the return on investment for these two transitions.
Okay, that's good. That makes sense. You know, Shannon, for a long time when people talked about V6, and probably not you because you were dealing with it in such depth, but for a long time the conversations were always just surface level. You know, does your product support it? Does it support it in hardware? Are all the features there? We're well past that, aren't we? I mean, we're past the sort of the RFP check boxes, and we're now getting into what makes it unique. You know, what do the unique designs look like?
Certainly, that has always been a catastrophic mistake people have made, has really started off back in the day when people would look at IPv6 as just a single checkbox. And it's a much more comprehensive process that you have to go through. And so while we're definitely past the days of where the majority of your products or software do not support IPv6, we're well past those days. You're not all the way out of the woods yet as it relates to deployable IPv6 feature sets and performance across everything that an IT organization may invest in. So that will be an ongoing process, and it is an integral part of the planning and ongoing kind of truing up of your capabilities within your IT organization, is to continuously, not just one time, but continuously go through that gap analysis of what is it that I'm investing in, what is it that I have kind of moved out of my organization and brought into via a refresh cycle, for example, and making sure that what it is that I'm trying to do from an overall IT roadmap perspective, can that be supported over this next generation protocol called IPv6. So yes, we're past the initial part where the vast majority of your features or your platforms are going to be missing critical elements of IPv6, but you still will have that for quite some time. And design and implementation is the soup du jour, right? People are very accustomed to going through the gap analysis at this point, and folks like Chip's organization and Cisco Advanced Services and many of our channel partners have very robust assessment, planning, and design programs built into their overall product strategy that can help customers through there. What I have tended to focus on for many of the years, the years that I've been involved with IPv6, has been the design and the implementation side, simply because that's just what gets me excited and what I've been doing within Cisco for a very long time. Right. And what we're starting to find is that people are getting into the weeds of IPv6 and the deployment and figuring out that, hey, it's IP with a higher version number and there's some nuances I need to learn, but it's really not that bad. And as to kind of tag on to something Chip had talked about, we're really starting to see almost this shock factor of, wow, I was very fixated on IPv6 design inside my own enterprise, but I have completely alienated the fact that I'm in another part of my organization looking at offloading or perhaps totally moving part of my IT organization capabilities into the cloud. And so that's something that is like within the last few months has appeared in many of my customer calls, is the design requirements for moving V6 outside of your organization.
Okay. So I want to kind of connect a couple of dots, and Chip brought up a really good point about, when you're thinking about, if you're thinking about cloud computing, IPv6 probably ought to start to become a natural part of that thinking. And it may be because what you're talking about, Shannon, you're going to want to interact with various service providers, or it's like Chip was talking about, you don't want to have to do redesign twice. You don't want to have to kind of re-architect twice. A lot of times, in the cloud space, especially sort of people that were building, say, private clouds, for example, you'd hear this talk about sort of journey to the cloud, right? Where it was kind of a multi-stage process that would be, in a lot of cases, infrastructure first. They would kind of get infrastructure consistent. It would virtualize that infrastructure, begin to virtualize those applications. They'd add automation as they went along. Is there kind of a parallel sort of journey to V6 that people tend to follow, where it's obviously an assessment of where you are. They've got to make some decisions about 4 to 6 conversion, and there's a ton of technologies there. Maybe they do some stuff that's isolated. I mean, when you guys are talking to customers, whether you're doing it as a vendor or as a consultant, or you're just hearing best practices, do they tend to talk about it as being sort of a journey, and there's kind of well-defined steps that people get to?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that unlike other really cool technologies that an IT organization may adopt for whatever business case justification, most of them impact a certain user population or a certain part of their infrastructure. With IPv6, it's IP. So it's everywhere you have IP today. At one point or another, you'll end up with IPv6 in those same locations. So it's ubiquitous in nature as it relates to touching every element within your IT, portfolio of services and products and so forth. And so, because of that, you cannot take this all or nothing approach. It has to absolutely be a phased approach that is based upon generally 2 things: your use case and your time frame. And so very often when we have conversations with enterprise customers, we generally walk them through, okay, why are you doing this? Is it based upon a use case? You're a vendor and you're writing software for a new TV set or a game controller or, whatever the case might be, and you need to get developers into an IPv6 build environment, okay? That's one use case. And if that's your use case, what is your time frame for getting that done? And so as you walk through that, kind of almost in a Q&A type of conversation with them, you can build a framework that you can phase out for how they would implement IPv6. And very often, they're questions that they have not asked themselves, and it's somewhat enlightening in the conversation to figure out, well, we never really thought about what our time frame is, and we just thought we would do IPv6 for due diligence to prepare for it, but we haven't really fully, vetted out what our use cases are. So the phases that you go through and that journey that you would take very often are dictated based upon the use case and the time frame.
Okay. Yes, and so Brian, I wanted to add one more piece here to what Shannon was talking about. So the interesting thing about if you look at the cloud and V6 discussions, if you look at them side by side, you can draw almost a one-to-one parallel, because you can do the same thing. You can think about, right, first let me see how the infrastructure is going to look like. You talk about virtualization and you talk about this integration of the new protocol. The next step, let's say, is going to be to assess where your applications stand. Both on the cloud, you want to figure out what is going to fit for the private cloud, what's going to fit in the public cloud, in the hybrid environment. Same thing for IPv6. You need to evaluate the application in order to assess them for IPv6 readiness and the implication of them running on IPv6. So if you lay these 2 roads side by side, you see all these touching points. A very simple example. If you have a large enterprise with 2,000 plus applications in your portfolio, and you're going to have to evaluate and assess these to see where do they fit in terms of a cloud delivery model, why not do the V6 assessment at the same time, save money, save time, and integrate all this into the larger next generation IT vision?
Gotcha. So when you're doing that, so let's say you're smart enough, you kind of go, okay, I'm gonna think through it that way, without. And I'm not looking to turn this into sort of pointing fingers or highlighting anybody. Are there any parts of the Shannon mentioned early on, we're way past the kind of surface level, but are there any sectors of technology these days, whether it's storage or virtualization or certain types of applications that just haven't kept up and people should go, okay, I'm going to kind of avoid that for now? Or is it pretty consistent in terms of Oracle does it, VMware does it, Cisco does it, Juniper does it, EMC and NetApp do it? I mean, is there anybody lagging at this point in terms of a section of technology?
Well, I think, as a part of the gap analysis and the assessment process, a lot of people get fixated on layer 3 devices, routers, switches, firewalls, and load balancers and so forth. And they assume that because the networking vendors are involved with it, that the application and operating system vendors are as well. And so the number one place that we're finding quite a bit of lagging IPv6 functionality are in unique line of business applications within specific verticals. So if you take a look, you mentioned some of them, VMware and Oracle and Microsoft. If you take a look at Exchange, SharePoint, those types of applications that are very prevalent throughout the enterprise, that stuff is in really good shape. It's generally when I'm an automotive manufacturer or I'm in the legal business or healthcare and I've got a very specific vertical that is revenue generating, that is paramount to the success of my day-to-day operations. Those are generally the ones that people leave to the very end because they just didn't think about them, but yet they're the absolute most important thing to their business. Those are the areas where we've seen the greatest gaps, are really those unique verticalized applications in those spaces. Other than that, I'm sure there's some lagging going on, but for the most part, we've got great success with many, many enterprises from all different ranges, all the way from the infrastructure itself through to the application.
Okay.
Yes, I would say that we've came a very long way from the early days in terms of readiness, and really right now we are looking at very specific things that we need to check when we want to ensure end-to-end readiness. But in the end, we are talking about end-to-end stories now that include a lot of features, a lot of capabilities. And so minor gaps here and there could undermine an end-to-end story. So that's why it's as Shannon was pointing out a little bit earlier, it's still important to do the assessment. It's still important to have the end-to-end perspective. However, off-the-shelf vendors are in a very good position, much better than they used to be. The challenges come with in-house development and in-house applications, and Shannon and I know a very good example of a very important application of an organization that was completely built on top of an early version of Apache that was not supporting IPv6, and that early version of Apache was embedded very tightly into the application architecture. So unless you go, you evaluate that, you understand those dependencies, and you insert an IPv6 set of requirements into the life cycle of that application, you can find yourself at the 12th hour to realize that, hey, this particular thing is not going to go to V6 in a very short time frame.
Okay, so that
absolutely, and to follow up on that, I think that when we look at deployment options, many customers come and they're like, why are there so many choices available to me for deploying IPv6 in any one of these various use cases? I didn't have that in IPv4. I just turned on IPv4, and if it was facing the internet, I would NAT, PAT, or proxy it. But other than that, I just ran IPv4 and routed it as needed. And with IPv6, we got stateless and stateful NAT64. We got integrated server load balancing with translation. We got Lisp. We got reverse proxies. We got all these different technological capabilities to allow someone to either purely from an end-to-end dual stack perspective get IPv6 done, or if there's all of these B, C, and D use cases that can't happen, there's all of these backup offerings. And I think it really is 100% based upon the capabilities of the applications. Because, very often we've all been in networking a long time. And so we don't change a layer 3 topology because you're deploying a new version of Exchange. That just isn't the way you design networks. But very often we're seeing in IPv6 that the application themselves, whether it be internal to their enterprise or something that they're trying to port off into a cloud environment, are actually dictating the topology and the layer 3, layer 4 through 7 capabilities of the overall design are actually dictated very often by the capability of the app. So the app is the single most important element in the overall IPv6 design that a customer would go through.
Okay, and it's interesting you guys bring that up. We did with the last show that we did, or a couple of shows ago, we did with we were talking about mobile devices, and we were talking with Tal Klein from Citrix and Brian Katz, and Tal brought up, we got into this conversation about what they were kind of jokingly calling crapplications, but Tal said, as much as everybody wants to talk about cool apps for mobile and all this sort of stuff, and is VDI good or VDI bad, he said, the number one application that people want to emulate or send out to an endpoint is these things that are supported with IE6, which is old browser technology, stuff that people hate because it wasn't compatible with a lot of things. And I think you guys are basically kind of reinforcing that, except in a different context. You may be talking about embedded systems, PLC logic controllers on a shop floor. I think what you're ultimately getting at is the things that, while they're important, aren't technically sophisticated, aren't the things that are getting the headlines, but they're the sort of those like kind of niggling little things that are going to keep you from being really pure, and that's why we have all these extra technologies to help people get end to end, even though there may be some band-aids in between.
Absolutely, and I've done my 2 lives at Cisco are enterprise IPv6, and then all things related to applications in the data center. And I'll tell you that the two were totally siloed areas of interest and coverage that I worked with, and now as I'm totally embedded in VDI and so forth, we actually start to see those 2 points not necessarily in parallel anymore, but they're totally unified in their product, in their problem description, in that you hit a perfect point. If I'm a legacy organization where a specific web application I have written is very in tune with the capability of IE6 only, and IE6 may or may not have IPv6 functionality for other web applications that you're embracing, not just that legacy version, then you've now diverged your traditional application interoperability problem and its incompatibility with a new protocol that you're trying to deploy. And so more and more we'll start to see this convergence of challenges that overlay on top of one another, and that is dealing with legacy application environments, whatever that may be, and the implementation of a new protocol in your environment. And the two initially look like they're independent of one another, but very often they overlay on top of each other and very often compound the issue overall.
Okay.
Yes, and so I think what we can do also, we can turn this a little bit on its head, and we can look at it from a future perspective and say, well, let's take the cloud perspective, let's take the IPv6 perspective, and now putting the two together, we can make a yet even stronger argument for re-architecting some of these applications that we build within our enterprise. And so now when you talk about truly cloud-ready standards for our application development, and truly application-ready standards for our application development, we can really build this next generation set of standards that will drive and will enable the businesses as we expect them to. And going forward, I strongly believe that the tie-in between application design and the availability of these unique identifiers and very powerful large identifiers that are the IPv6 addresses will change the game in general in how our IT environments will look like.
One of the things whenever we do technology changes is, people are going to learn new stuff, but anytime there's change, there's got to be sort of that motivating factor for them, even for technologists. So let's say you guys are, you're selling IPv6, not just to solve a specific problem. Like Shannon mentioned, you're going to go into the Asian market, or you're going to go into the game console market. But give me a couple of, what are the cool things that IPv6 does above and beyond what everybody knows feature functionality wise that's there with IPv4 today? What gets people excited when you're talking to them about IPv6, that they go, well, not only do I got to learn it, but I want to learn about that thing, because that seems really cool. That seems like it might solve a problem in a really new way.
I'll actually bring up a relevant point from a conference call that I had over WebEx just last week with an enterprise customer, and this is quite frequent. Is a lot of people are looking for this, fireworks show of coolness. When they hear IPv6, they say, oh my God, this is going to solve world hunger, right? And the reality of it is that it is just a protocol, and so while there's some coolness involved with it, it's not like this massive fireworks show that's going to go off and solve all of your IT problems that, like many enterprise customers, expect.
Okay.
But there are elements around it that absolutely do solve real IT problems, and a perfect example was with a large financial customer that we were talking with last week, and they are like any organization that are global in nature, and at given times of year or given times of their business cycle, they may increase and decrease headcount at branch offices. And we've all done this before, where we break out our Excel spreadsheet or our favorite IPAM tool, and we're constantly jacking with bits in IPv4 to figure out, okay, I had 8 people at this branch, now I've got 15. Do I need to change the subnets associated with that because I'm constantly running out of space? Well, just the fact that you have this monstrosity of address space, and that the important factors in IPv6 addressing are no longer how many networks you have and how many hosts per networks you have. It's more how many networks do you have. And we don't really care about the number of hosts you have in your overall organization. And so this just kind of lit the guy up that was actually in charge of addressing for this financial environment, that said he spends 80+% of his day constantly manipulating their IPAM tool to forecast and build new addressing structures with variable length mask in IPv4 just for branch offices. I mean, this is 80% of this guy's job. And the fact that he can now move into IPv6 and never, ever again have to worry about, did they hire 8 or 80,000 people at a given branch? He has the address configuration built in already with the capabilities to deal with that. So they now are excited to him to finally break out of that mold, at least one day when they get IPv6 as a prevalent functionality in their environment. And that challenge is totally solved for him. And so that is one of the cool elements that people discover that they don't even really think about initially until you explain it to them.
Okay, cool.
Yeah,
plug and play subnetting.
Yeah, I would echo the same idea. I have the same experience. So addressing sounds like a very boring thing and is not that big of a deal, but it's amazing how many problems actually it solves for people. And I'm seeing the same thing with our customers. So once you start to put them on this train of thought that Shannon was mentioning, forget about addressing, forget about how many hosts per domain you have, think about networks. All of a sudden, people that have never really paid attention to IPv6 really join in the discussion because they immediately see the value that it's going to bring to their operations. One of my customers, also a large enterprise, they are seeing or they are projecting a 5x increase in terms of the devices that are joining their infrastructure. And they are having a hard time as is in order to manage users and number of users per domain, similar to Shannon's example. And so you bring up the V6 discussion, and all of a sudden they are sold because they see right away the value it is going to bring to them. But the interesting thing to me is that that's the first step. That solves the burning immediate problem. But then right after that, they start to add on their own new ideas where maybe the coolness factor increases, if you would. Maybe all of a sudden the wireless team that was all psyched about the idea that I'm not going to have to closely manage the number of users per SSID, all of a sudden thinks, oh, but now that I understand a little bit more about IPv6, I realize that I can create this really dynamic environment where I can leverage capabilities like DHCP PD in order to provision them and tear them apart really quickly on very mobile sites that I need to deploy. And so the idea is we open the door with the IPv6 addressing discussion, which invariably solves a lot of problems in very nice and elegant ways. But then customers start to discover these new ways in which IPv6 becomes a differentiator.
Okay. And when you guys are talking to customers about this, obviously it depends on the size of their business and the size of their problem. But how long do you typically see, if there's a way to put typically around that, how long do these transitions take? I mean, when people are looking at doing V6 plus cloud types of projects, is it realistic to get things done in 6 months? Is it a year? Is it how do people wrap their head around how long the transitions take?
Well, I'm going to rain on your parade.
Okay.
And I will tell you that it will never end, right?
Okay.
Because you are constantly moving within IT to something else, right? You're doing unified communication. You are adding multiple data centers, or you're consolidating data centers. You're doing branch consolidation. You're doing something, and all of that has a dependency on IP. So while you can finish, depending on the size of the organization and what their specific goals are, you can finish these rather quickly. I mean, if you're just trying to serve content to the internet, for example, you can do an internet edge design, in a matter of just a few weeks, depending on what you're doing. But if you're trying to embrace IPv6 holistically across your entire organization, that's cool. You can get that done, and some of the largest organizations we know have solved that within an 18, 24-month window. But you're constantly doing something new to the environment. That means that you probably, for a period of time, and this is why I don't like the term transition, I like the term coexistence. Because you're not yanking IPv4 off the wire instantaneously. You need to embrace IPv6 in a non-disruptive way into your environment and use it for what your real business requirements dictate. And then as time goes on, you will have this kind of a purpose of duality, where everything that you do, you need to ensure that you can run in the legacy IPv4 world, but you can also embrace in the new IPv6 world, and that is a very, very long-term cycle that you're going to have to embrace. So I really avoid with customers this how long will this crap take kind of discussion, because in essence, it probably will never end until you retire.
Okay.
Well, I'm partially agreeing with Shannon. This is a first. So, I would say that, like everything else, right? When you do something, you can do it. You have three options, right? You can do it fast, you can do it cheap, or you can do it well. You can have two of each, but not all three at the same time. And so this applies very much, in my mind, to the transition or to IPv6 adoption in general. I think the biggest risk that an organization runs is not to give enough time for the V6 transition. You could do it very fast and not really make the most out of it. If you do it very fast, you're not going to make it very cheap. And in my experience, working with very large deployments, it takes 3-4 years for a complete integration of V6, simply because the organization will inevitably go to several iterations, really matching the target architecture. As we move along within an organization with IPv6 integration, there is a lot of additional information that tweaks the design along the way. We are still away from having solid best practices. We have good case studies, but we are away from best practices. So in other words, this IPv6 integration process is going to take time if you want to do it right, and you should give it a lot of time if you don't want to spend a lot of money in order to do it quickly. That being said, for many years, we've been growing, and I've been growing up in this world with V6 under this idea that we are going to see V6 and V4 coexistence for a very long time. And so, I've been batting around the typical 10, 20 years even for how long V4 and V6 are going to coexist. one of the things that, at least that I have been seeing recently from my customers, is a very clear message that once they see it in place, once they see the target, they are very aggressive on finding a way to really get to a v6 only environment. It's not an easy thing to do, but it's an aspirational thing, and it's becoming much, much more aggressive because they're concerned with the idea of managing two different infrastructures at the same time. And here I'm not talking about legacy. I'm not talking about a small island of IPv4 somewhere in a corner. I'm really talking about true dual stack across the entire footprint. So it's going to be very interesting to see in the coming 2 years or so how much this coexistence will really last.
Okay. So, sort of last question, I'll wrap this up because I want to be conscious of your guys' time. In that same vein, right? So obviously, with you guys being sort of gurus, Shannon, talking about this lasting for years and years, you guys are set for years, probably until you retire. People are going to be coming to you about how to do this. If you're talking to somebody who is a CCIE, you're talking to an IT professional, networking professional, whatever. Like, what are the steps to what should they be learning? Where should they be going to get good information about this? How to learn, ways to sort of play with this in their labs? What are the best kind of getting started for the technologists out there?
In this industry, I think that we're very accustomed to, grabbing your normal Cisco Press book or some book that you can grab off Amazon or whatever to go learn, and there's excellent resources for that. I mean, Chip has co-authored several books, deploying IPv6 and global IPv6 strategies. There's an excellent IPv6 security book out there by Eric Vinke and Scott Hogue, and I've authored an enterprise-focused book. So that's generally where people begin their investigation of IPv6, and that is just simply to true up the differences between IPv4 and IPv6, and to pull in the new things that IPv6 offers that people need to very tactically be aware of before they begin any implementation. But following that, I think that people, depending on their role, will kind of move towards perhaps standards bodies as trying to investigate what's up and coming. IETF obviously is extremely active with IPv6 and has been for a very long time, and so people look at what is up and coming at the same time as what is real and what can I do now. And so very often the traditional investigation of books, blogs, and then kind of researching, when you have insomnia and you can't sleep, you go pull your favorite RFC from Chip and you're out in a matter of seconds. Those are the elements that people tend to kind of stick with because that's what they know. And I've not seen a massive movement away from that type of learning.
Okay. Chip, what about you?
Yes. So education is very important. I'll be honest, it's very hard to find people in the industry that have the experience that folks like Shannon has, and that we've been working on this for a very long time. So this is definitely a career opportunity. What I typically recommend to folks is go ahead and do a first quick pass through the technology. Do a quick review of what IPv6 is all about, and the value of that is going to offer you the confidence to feel that all the work and the experience that you gained in v4 is going to help. But once you did that, don't stop there. Go back, take it more in depth. As Shannon was pointing out, read some of the RFCs, get to the more advanced books, get into the lab, because that is what's going to highlight the true fundamental differences between IPv4 and IPv6, those things that are going to enable you to build a true next generation network, truly make the most of the IPv6 transition. And so it's going to take a little bit of time if you want to do it right. And this is very much at the individual level. If we are talking about organizational level, our company Info6 offers training, and we also offer IPv6 Forum Gold certification. The
what we see with these trainings that we are offering is that it's important for organizations to understand and put in place a training program. It's not enough to send 1, 2, 3, a few people to a class. You need to provide the right type of knowledge to the right people at the right time that will fit in this long-term engagement that is going to be the IPv6 transition. Otherwise, you send a few people to do a few things here early on. They don't get a chance to get in depth. They don't get the chance to get their hands on the lab, and they'll forget by the time their knowledge is really needed. So it's important to start early.
Okay, well, very cool. Well, so yeah, my daughter's first and second grade. They're starting to learn Mandarin in their school. I'll have to tell the teachers to add IPv6 to the curriculum. So, guys, real quick, where can people find you over the next couple of months at shows and events, and where can they find you on the internet?
Go, Chip.
Well, our website, www.nifos6.com. Nifos, by the way, stands for cloud in Greek, and 6, IPv6. So we've been active in several of the IPv6 events so far, and we'll continue to be at the typical IPv6 events. Our COO, Yuri Rich, is going to be at GlobeCom, leading a panel there for IPv6 discussion, and they're going to touch into IPv6 and cloud. Yes, any cool. IPv6 event that is coming up, we definitely going to be there.
You'll be there. Shannon, what about you?
I got Cisco Live London coming up at the end of January 2012, where I'll be doing my normal enterprise IPv6 design session. In addition to that, I'm on Twitter at IPv6, as in EYEPv6. I also am finishing right now, in fact, a new Cisco validated design for deploying IPv6 in the enterprise internet edge. That'll be on the www.cisco.com/go/design zone website coming up here in probably the next 3 or 4 weeks. And also we have quite a full docket of events. Interop, the Rocky Mountain IPv6 Summit is happening again next year here in Denver. And so there's a lot of places that people can come and throw rotten fruit and so forth at me when they feel the need.
Very cool. Well, if anybody sees Chip or Shannon out and about, buy them a beer, bring a napkin. They'll do some IPv6 designs for you guys. So for Shannon and Chip, thank you very much. We're out of time for this week. You can follow us on Twitter at the Cloudcast, or reach us on the web at thecloudcast.net. You'll find links to the show. You can leave us a comment. You can send us an email or get details about how to also stream the show on Stitcher. So for Chip and for Shannon, thanks to everybody for being on, and for everybody out there, thanks for listening.